Hi, everyone. My name is Rachelle Dene Poth, and I'm really excited to be here to share with you some ideas that I believe can be quite helpful to you, regardless of where you are teaching from. And so I'll talk to you a little bit today about fostering connections and collaborations, which is what I like to refer to it as, but also specific to remote learning, hybrid learning, whatever you want to refer to it as, and also focusing on social emotional learning skills, which are important as well. And so if at any time you have any questions for me, would love to connect with you. On Twitter, it's rdene915. I have a blog site that is the rdene915.com. I also have a podcast where I talk about a lot of the different ideas and things of what I've been using in my classroom. And so just to tell you a little bit about myself, I am a Spanish and esteem teacher. I'm also a consultant and an attorney, so I love school. I've gotten a lot of different interactions over the years between learning at conferences, also with my students, being able to really connect with them, build relationships, and learn from them. So I'm always excited to share some of the ideas of things we have done in my classroom, many of the ideas that have come to be because I've taken some chances with some different activities and they didn't necessarily go that well. And so then I've taken the opportunity to ask my students for some of their own ideas. So I stay connected. Again, I love learning, love sharing ideas, and I really enjoy trying things in my classroom and also being able to share the things that we are doing so that if I can save some time for somebody else, if somebody's looking for a new idea, or if there's a challenge that you're facing, hopefully some of these different possibilities that I'll talk to you about will come in handy as we potentially transition into and out of our classrooms this year. So the biggest thing for me, when I think about whether it's tools or if it's just different methods that I want to use in my classroom, I always focus on some specific goals and thinking about how can I engage my students more in what they're learning. Can I give them more choices? How can I really understand what my students are able to do with the content that I am teaching them? And beyond that, being realistic and knowing, and I joke with my students all the time, and I say, I know that not all of you are going to go on and major in Spanish, and you're not all going to become Spanish teachers. What can I provide for you that will help you after you leave my classroom, after you leave our school? And I know that in speaking a language in the classroom, it is uncomfortable for students to begin to speak the language. And I know even as an adult, there are times where I feel uncomfortable or I don't have that confidence in presenting ideas or sharing what I'm learning if I am a student in the classroom, for example. So what are some things that I could do to give my students a chance to build their confidence, to become better at communicating, to become more comfortable with communicating and collaborating with their students, the other students that are in the classroom. And then beyond that, give them the chance to take more of a lead in the classroom. And for many years, I didn't actually think about that I was working on helping students to develop their social emotional learning skills, but I've done some research over the last couple of years, and I realized that while at first when somebody asked me about SEL, as they said, I wasn't really clear on what that meant, but once I did some research and started to think about the methods and the tools I was using in my classroom, I realized that I was already providing some opportunities for my students. And so if you are looking for different resources or some other information, whether it be to provide for parents, for yourself, for things for remote learning, I definitely recommend that you go to the castle.org site where there are tons of things available for educators and for parents, but to look at the 5 competencies of social emotional learning. And they are set out on this graphic that was actually created for one of my books by a friend of mine. And we can think about the things that we do in our classroom. How can we provide opportunities for our students to develop in these areas of self-awareness and social awareness? And of course, relationship skills, helping them with self-management, and of course, responsible decision-making, and looking at some of the methods that you might already be using. One example I can think of is project-based learning, helping students to understand what people experience in other parts of the world, to develop empathy. In my classroom, we look at different places where Spanish is spoken, and for my students that have done project-based learning, what they have been able to learn and how they've been able to basically lead themselves into their own direction and bring all of that back to their classmates and to me has made a big difference. And so whatever we can do to help our students build these skills, and there are lots of different options that we have for this, so I'll share some of these with you today. Now, thinking about methods that you're already using, and as we are in many cases working in some form of virtual learning experience, if you are fully in person, then these will apply for you as well when I share some of these ideas. And if you are fully virtual, same thing, you just might have to make a few adjustments. But the important thing is to remember that we need to have things in place, whether it is a specific digital tool, if it is a method, just a lot of possibilities in what we often call our toolkit to help us if we do need to make some transitions. And when I started to really focus on student engagement and social emotional learning in my classroom was because I was noticing the interactions with my students. I was recognizing that some of them were kind of afraid to respond. They had that fear of being wrong. Dealing with stress, for example, handling a lot of different tasks and balancing that and time management. So I really wanted to provide a lot of other options for them to become better at managing all of those things that I know that we as adults also need some help with those too. So the idea is to think about what are some different tools, what are some different strategies that we can use in our classrooms to help our students to build not only skills in the content area that we are teaching, but also to build skills that are essential for the future. And so looking at social emotional learning skills and what are some of the tools, the strategies that we can use to help them to build those skills in our classroom and also that will transfer out of the classroom. Now, thinking about some of the tools that you may see here on this screen or some of the activities that are listed, like if you do things like scavenger hunts or you play games, for example, in your classroom, there are so many choices. The nice thing is with so many of these, you don't have to start from scratch. There's not a big learning curve, and it's not that you just use one of these tools for one purpose and that's it. So the key is really not about finding so many different tools and overwhelming yourself, and more importantly, you don't want to overwhelm the students, but finding a few that enable you to really provide a lot for the students in your classroom. And so the biggest thing is how can we foster those connections for our students? And one tool that has really made a big difference in my classroom over the last 5 years that I've used it is Buny. And the reason that I like it is because it does provide so many possibilities for all content levels, all grade levels. It doesn't matter if it's kindergarten through high school, higher education, and beyond. It is something that we can use regardless of where the learning is actually happening. Now, at the beginning of the school year, what I tend to do is I want to obviously get to know my students, and I want for my students to get to know each other. And so there are many possibilities within Buny. The simplest one would be creating an about me. So as a teacher, I want my students to know me. I want their families to get to know who I am as a teacher and what I'm hoping for in the class for this year. So I will create an about me Buny. There are templates already available, so you can just change them, change the colors if you want, or leave it the exact same way that it is and just put in your own information. I have my students create their own. Then you can share them in one space, which is a Buny board, and have the students look at all of their classmates. You can have students record audio or even video, and that helps as well when we're talking about building confidence, because students can record the video. Even as a teacher, you can record the video, and if you don't like it, if you make a mistake, you can always go back and fix that and do it over again. It does integrate with some other tools you may be using. So looking at the images on the screen, like for Flipgrid, for example, I use for so many reasons in my Spanish and also my STEAM course. Most importantly, just because it creates a space where we can have conversations, where we can get to know one another and build those relationships, even if we're not in the same physical classroom space. It has also helped my students and me to become connected with other classrooms. Connecting with a classroom in Argentina and one in Spain having conversations, building those global connections, building their social awareness has made a big difference, especially when they were doing project-based learning in my class, being able to listen to what it sounds like when somebody from Argentina speaks Spanish as opposed to somebody from Spain, being able to ask questions of their own classmates and see and hear each other. And the same thing for me as their teacher, being able to make those connections, especially if we're not able to be in the same physical space and build the relationships like we would be doing at the beginning of the school year. So there are a lot of possibilities for integrating with Buny and with Flipgrid and just creating an opportunity for students to make those connections, which are so important for learning. And so here are just a few ideas of things that you can do as a teacher, also to have students do, depending on what it is that you teach. Start with an about me, or most recently I've had my students creating a digital business card and pretending, or not even pretending, but thinking about what they might like to do in the future, or what is a job or something that they think might exist in the future, and create a digital business card or a flyer for a business. Maybe if you have students doing some readings of different books that they've chosen, instead of doing a book report, have them create something using Buny for a book recommendation. Icebreakers you can do. You can use Buny for check-ins, or even for foods, share recipes. And it doesn't have to be specific to a foods class. I know in my Spanish classes, we talk a lot about foods and culture and finding recipes and sharing them from different Spanish-speaking countries. It's just fun to create, and there are so many possibilities that meet each student's interests and needs. And of course, depending on technology, whether students say, oh, I really love using technology, or even if you have students who say, you know what, I would rather draw, there are options available within Buny where students can draw if they want, and it's all combined into that one space. Flipgrid, which I mentioned, is great, of course, for so many reasons. Building relationships at the start of this school year. My school was fully virtual, and as the only Spanish teacher, the majority of the students that I have, I already know from the year before. However, this year I did have new students in Spanish 1, also in my 8th grade STEAM course, so I wasn't going to have the opportunity to get to know them in the physical classroom space. So I wanted to be able to introduce myself, to talk about the classes, but I also wanted to get to know them. And so I set up some different prompts on Flipgrid. And also I set it so that the students initially would be able to post their own response and then listen to their other classmates, respond to their other classmates if they wanted to, and I could also give them some feedback as well, whether I wanted it to just be something that I wrote or if I wanted to use video feedback. But then there are times that we want our students to feel really comfortable in recording a video, so you can set it so that you can moderate the video. And I often get the question from them that says, you know, I recorded this video and it just disappeared, or I'm not sure if the video went through. And I have to tell them, that's because I set it to moderate so that you felt comfortable knowing that I was the only one that was going to see the video and give you the feedback. And so again, as a language teacher, if I want my students to do some speaking assessments, if I want to use it as a way for students to check in with me, I can set it up so I can moderate the video and give them an opportunity to kind of share what they're doing, how they're feeling, what they're learning, and then be able to give them that feedback in a space that's comfortable for them and helps them to build the confidence as well. And something else that I really like about tools like Flipgrid is that they integrate with so many other tools. And so if you are using, like in my school, we use Microsoft Teams. If you are Google Classroom, you have those options. Even using a tool like Nearpod, for example, it helps you to feel less overwhelmed. And of course, for the students and families, supporting them to feel less overwhelmed when these tools are available and they kind of integrate with each other. And so Flipgrid, for having students kind of practice if they were giving a speech, for example. And it's kind of funny because I've had students who did not want to do presentations in our classroom in front of their classmates, but were fine with recording a video on Flipgrid and then having me play it in the classroom, or having the video be available for their classmates to see, even if we weren't in our classroom space. But the fact that they can take the time and they can record it in their own space where they're comfortable, go back and do it again if they want to, has really made a difference. And that is something I noticed on my own, but also that many students have told me over the years that we've been using Flipgrid in our classroom. So lots of possibilities, even looking at some of the different prompts. And if you want to use things like Wonderopolis or see what other topics are available to use in your classroom, it's very easy to get started with and doesn't take much time at all. And it's fun to get to know the students using Flipgrid and see what other effects they put, whether it's a different background. They use some of the other features like the different text on the bottom, but it's a good way also as a teacher where you can create some lessons and share those with students, and they can watch them and go back and review them as they need to. So another one that is really good for lots of different reasons, like I say, you don't need to use all of the different tools or all of the different methods, but when you can find some that really are quite versatile and have lots available for you to get started with, that's what it makes a difference. And for these ones that I've used, these are pretty much the common ones that I tend to use and help the students build kind of the relationships in the classroom, work together, collaborate, build their digital citizenship skills, and help me to understand where they are in terms of learning, but also to get to know them, what they're about, what are their interests, and have conversations after I see what their responses have been, for example. Or if we're in the classroom, using student-paced works, but also doing a lesson live where I can move around, I can interact with them. At times they can interact with each other. It has been a really good tool to use over the years. And what I like about it is that it has so many different options available for things that you can create and add into it. And again, there are thousands of lessons available in the library that you don't need to start from scratch. You can also take some things like if you have a PowerPoint, if you have a Google Slides presentation, content that you've already created, and add that into Nearpod. Also by choosing some of the different activities. So having students maybe brainstorm, and if you're not in your classroom space, I actually use this in my class quite often, have students collaborate where you ask them a question and it's shared on a collaborate board, which is kind of like a bulletin board, and they have their little post-it notes, but it gives them a chance to see what others are thinking, to share ideas. They can like and kind of comment also if they wanted to post something else on it. But for my students in Spanish 3 a couple of years ago, we were working on our project-based learning, but also they were learning about vocabulary related to travel. And they kept saying, it would be so awesome if we could go to Argentina, or it would be so great if those students in Argentina could come to Pittsburgh. And they wanted to plan this trip because the vocabulary was talking about travel arrangements and all of those things related to like, what do you need if you're going to travel to someplace like Argentina? And I said, why don't you create a trip and we'll use Nearpod? And so what they did is they worked together on a Google Slides presentation. They each had a role. So they could work in class. They could also work outside of class. So they're building all of those skills for, the asynchronous learning and the collaboration. Then we took and used my Nearpod account and converted their slides into a Nearpod lesson. And then they worked together to add in different activities. So they put in some of the different virtual reality, kind of the tours. They took them on field trips to Pittsburgh. They added in some polls and some other questions to kind of ask the students, like, where would you want to stay? What types of places would you want to visit? And we shared that with the students in Argentina who had never heard of Nearpod. And after they got our Nearpod lesson of, why don't you come to Pittsburgh? About 2 weeks later, we received a lesson from them that they had created for a trip for my students to go to Argentina. And so I thought it was a really great exchange, not just of my students getting to practice the vocabulary and the verbs that they were learning, but also to build skills in a different way because they created the Google Slides, they collaborated, and each had their own role that they had to play. But then they applied it at a higher level because they used Nearpod and they were able to create this and share this with those other students. Plus, in the process, they taught the other students about this technology and they had that exchange of information, which was more meaningful because they created it for each other. So Nearpod is one that I recommend when people say, if I were to pick one tool, Buny, Nearpod, Flipgrid, because you can do so many things with them. And all of those right now integrate with each other. So great choices to get started with, especially if you're looking for something to try to bring students together to collaborate. Also, if you're looking for some lessons to help students build skills in different areas. Let's say you want to do a lesson on social emotional learning or digital citizenship. You can find lessons already available within the Nearpod library, and then just add some of your own content or activities to those lessons that are already available to you. Okay, Padlet. Another one of my favorites for many years because of all of the different possibilities you have for using Padlet. And for me, when I started, it was simply a space where I was having students post their projects. Instead of taking the time in class to use a flash drive or to go through email and pull their project up, if it was done with something using technology, creating a Padlet where they could post the link and we could have those on display, also to have that available to students when they weren't in the classroom. Using it for a discussion, for example. I had students at one point on a collaborate kind of experience using Padlet, and I shared that same Padlet with another classroom across the state of Pennsylvania. I also shared it with the classroom in Argentina, and everybody was writing on the board at the same time. And I remember the reaction of my students who were just so amazed that they could be where they were, and the other students, some in the same state, but some in a totally different country, were writing on and interacting in that same space. And it taught them a lot of lessons. One, digital citizenship, of course, because responsible posting, and being able to basically share where they were joining from, what it was like to be in school in the United States, or what family life was like, or some questions that they asked each other using that space that we were kind of monitoring, but it was giving them that chance to really engage in authentic, meaningful conversation with other students. I've seen some people use this for many other reasons beyond what I have shared here, but even something like a scavenger hunt, which was something I came up with really quickly on a Friday back in the spring, and simply created a Padlet. I had two different lists of objects that kind of coincided with vocabulary my students in Spanish 1 and Spanish 2 and actually Spanish 3 were working on, and broke them into groups who were using Zoom, and they worked together on a scavenger hunt. They could talk to each other in the breakout rooms, and they could post what they were finding for the scavenger hunt on the Padlet. So my students used to joke years ago that I had thousands of Padlets on a Padlet, and that wasn't quite the case, but you do have a lot of possibilities with it. Now, I've had students create their own Padlet and use it for a digital portfolio to put different projects that they've done. And it's not all about the technology, because students can take a picture of something they've drawn, for example, and post it on a Padlet. You can use it to take a quick picture with your webcam. You can record your voice with your microphone and give some feedback to students if you use it for that way. But also for project-based learning, one of my students, as you can see in the image on the top right, used it as a place to kind of store her thoughts along the way as she was working on her project-based learning. So many possibilities for using a tool like Padlet. And similar to Padlet is Wakelet, which again, like I said, these tools can be used for so many different possibilities in your classroom. And there are always more ideas out there. And so I find that asking students, how do you think you could use this? Or what is something that we could do a little bit differently with this tool? You get a lot of ideas. But with Wakelet, if you are not in your classroom, I had a teacher friend of mine about 6 months ago when schools first closed, asked how he could have students share resources or have a conversation, or he could post some different activities for his students to do, because at the time we were not using Microsoft Teams. And of course, I suggested things like Padlet and Wakelet because they are easy to get started with. Now, Wakelet is free. It does have some other options of things that you can add into it. You could put a bunch of resources for your students to look at. You could have students interact with each other and post some text, maybe post a video. You could use the Flipgrid feature in it as well. But it is a nice way to curate a lot of content that you're using. If you have Twitter chats and you want to share all of those tweets, for example, and they do have a newer feature that's called Spaces. Now, like I said, there are a lot of possibilities for using these tools, and some that are really quite innovative and fun. And one that I like to always talk about was done by my friend Laura Steinbrink, who created a scavenger hunt using Wakelet. And I could not wrap my head around it at first, but talk about having students collaborate and feel part of a learning community if they can do things like a scavenger hunt. And if you're already using a tool like Wakelet or Padlet, like I mentioned, for a scavenger hunt, those are ways that we can help our students to build those skills of social emotional learning, and also to kind of engage in what they're learning in a more authentic and meaningful way. And we can use the technology tools to provide those opportunities for students, even though we may not be in our physical classroom space. These tools that I've mentioned so far are ones that can help us if we do have to transition. So again, so many possibilities are out there. The idea is, what can we provide for our students that helps them to learn, of course, what we are teaching them. I want them to learn the Spanish, but I also want them to develop some other skills. I want them to feel part of a learning community. And that is something that a couple of my students years ago, when I made some changes in my classroom, had said that they felt so much more connected to their classmates because of the different activities that we were doing. They were able to record videos with Flipgrid and get to know each other beyond simply sitting in the classroom, or working together on a scavenger hunt and using Padlet, for example, being able to hear each other using the Zoom breakout rooms, being able to post and see what each other posted on those spaces made a difference. Other things that we can do that help students to feel more connected are games, and whether we use our digital options, things like quizzes or Kahoot or GimKit, for example, or if we use just hands-on regular card games, board games, games that we make up, or even better, games that our students make up, it helps them to build those relationships in the classroom. And so even though now my school is still virtual, I've been able to use some of these tools, and the students are figuring it out. They're talking and saying, you know, in code over the music in the background that probably is only playing in my ear, but they're building those skills. And when we are in the classroom, seeing them get up and move around, work on teams, ask each other questions, and take more of a lead has definitely made a difference. And I've seen so much growth in my students throughout the year as they start to build those relationships. And the biggest thing that I changed in my class was I got rid of the rows, and I stepped away from being the only person talking and gave them more choices. And at first that was uncomfortable because I was so used to having a plan and following that plan all the time. But I soon realized that I needed to become more flexible in what I was doing and create more opportunities where my students were able to take more of a lead in the classroom. And so ideas like this, the Buny, the Nearpod, the games, whether we're using, you know, hands-on, have students make up their own games, or we use the ones that are available through some of those digital tools that I mentioned, it's great to have a lot of choices available to us that we can provide for our students. And the last thing that I'll talk about, because I think this is just such a great opportunity for us, regardless, again, of what content area we teach or grade level, is project-based learning. And for many years, I thought I was doing PBL, but I was actually having my students learn based on projects. And it was a very limited span of, okay, here's what we're learning, let's practice, here's a quiz, and then at the end we did a project. And then I changed that a little bit, and instead I introduced the vocabulary, some of the verbs, then I would have them do a project towards the beginning of the unit, and then kind of work through everything else and assess them and move on. But then when I realized what authentic project-based learning was, it made a really big difference in my classroom. And so over the last probably 4 years now, we have changed a lot of the things, having students choose their own topic to explore if they want to focus on sports or culture or food or anything that matters to them. That's what I've kind of opened it up for them to choose, and I've been more flexible with it. But of course, there is always something to be learned. So whenever we started, I let them choose Fridays is what they decided to focus on, that being their period of time to work on their PBL. And I said I wasn't going to kind of hang around and hover. I wanted them to just drive their own learning. And what I found is that some of them needed that structure. They needed to know where to look. They needed to know what to create at the end of it. What was it supposed to look like? What do you mean I need to decide what I want to study? Because having that opportunity to be on their own and drive their own learning and make their own decisions, for some was uncomfortable, and it was uncomfortable for me as well. But what I noticed is after the first couple of months, having the conversations, talking with them one-on-one, getting their feedback, asking them to give each other feedback, which is something that we need to help them learn how to do as well, it started to become easier, and then we were able to add more to it. So when we started, it was simply connecting with a school in Argentina. Then we added on a school in Spain and used tools like Edmodo to have conversations. We then added on Flipgrid so they could see and hear each other and ask questions. Why are they wearing uniforms? Why are they going and changing classes and it's separate buildings, for example? But they were able to make those connections on their own. They were able to ask questions, have some fun learning, and just being curious about what's it like to live in Argentina? What's it like to go to school? And what are the sports? What are your customs? What is family life like? What are the stressors of being a teenager were some of the ones that my students asked. So that was something that they were able to control and decide what types of interactions they were going to have, what were they interested in learning, and what would their next steps be. So we added tools, Edmodo, we had the Flipgrid. We also, like I mentioned, Nearpod was another one we added on. And then of course, Buny, my students created their About Me and kind of shared that with the students in Spain and Argentina, who again had never heard of a lot of these tools. And not too long after my students created their Bunsies and shared them with the other students, we got some Bunsies back from the students in Spain. And it was a lot of fun to see what they shared. And for my students to say, wow, they get to go home for 2 hours for lunch or whatever they were learning from it. And so while I could tell my students about a lot of these topics, it made such a difference for them to be able to actually have those connections and feel as though they were part of this separate learning community with the classmates that they had in their own school, but also with those classmates that they made the connections with in Argentina and Spain. And for me as a teacher, being able to build those spaces and leverage the different tools or even the methods like project-based learning to give my students more opportunities it was pretty amazing to see and hear as they would present what they were learning, all of the information that they shared, and to hear from them and saying, like, this is not like anything else that I had ever done. So lots of possibilities out there for us to share with our students, ideas, many more than what I covered here today. But if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me, rdene915 on Twitter, also on Instagram. I have a blog site, which is the rdene915.com, and I post my own blogs. I also share some blogs from other educators. So if you have something that you're doing and you would like to share, please, by all means, let me know. I would love to post that on my blog site. And I also do have a podcast where I talk about some of the things that I'm doing in my classroom, some of the new ideas, things like social emotional learning, just different activities that you can use, even topics like augmented virtual reality, artificial intelligence, things that I've noticed bring in a lot of possibilities for my students, not just in my STEAM class, but also in my Spanish classes as well. And so I hope that today you've gotten a few ideas, and hopefully you will share your ideas with me as well. I would love to hear from you. And if you're using one of these tools that I mentioned, Buny, Flipgrid, Nearpod, Wakelet, if you're doing project-based learning, if you've used Padlet, how you are using those tools. There are, like I said, so many different possibilities. A lot of the ideas have come about from my students, and also just over the years of having conversations and just thinking a little bit differently. And sometimes that's all it takes, is we don't have to do all the things. We just need to find one thing to try. And years ago, when I noticed a disconnect in my classroom between my students and myself, when they had questions, and if I wasn't available, or if it came over the weekend, for example, just finding something to put into place where they could access, resources, they could ask me a question, they could connect with each other. These are just a few of those possibilities for doing that. And so I hope that it has been helpful. I thank you for joining in today. And again, if you have any questions, I would love to hear from you. Don't hesitate to reach out, rdene915. Have a great rest of your day.